Hi, Dick.
Good morning, Michelle.
How are you?
I'm great.
So, I'm with Dr. Dick Barry, and Dick obviously is a resident of ours at Woodland Pond here. And hearing my requests and inquiries of folks to share their experiences related to either civil rights or human rights, discrimination, those types of things, Dick immediately responded with some personal stories. And I asked if Dick would remember them with us. So why don't you take it from there?
Okay. My first direct experience with racial discrimination occurred in 1954 when I was a 17-year-old enlisted Navy man stationed at Bainbridge, Maryland. With three of my Navy buddies, all still teenagers and all from New York, one of whom was black, we made plans to go for the first time to the city of Baltimore on a weekend pass. Shortly after arriving, we decided to get something to eat and entered a typical diner. We were all wearing our full-dress Navy uniforms. There was a waitress behind the counter and a tall, burly white chef visible through the pass-through to the kitchen. We took our seats in a booth, selected some songs on the jukebox extension in each booth, and waited to be given menus. The diner was not crowded, with only a few people eating at the counter and no more than half of the booths occupied. We noticed people entering the diner after we had, and the waitress greeted them, and once they were settled in a booth, she quickly gave them menus. After this was repeated 3 or 4 times, we recognized that we were being ignored. I left the booth and walked to the counter, where I politely asked the waitress for 4 menus. She looked annoyed and called to the chef. He left the kitchen and motioned me to the other end of the counter where there were no customers. I followed him. Now, there are unexpected events that occur in your life that are so startling, so disturbing, and so revealing that they are indelibly imprinted in your memory, or actually seared in your soul, and you can recall minute details and replay every word, no matter how far in the distant past they might have occurred. Such was the next several minutes of my life. The chef, big and beefy, wearing a stained white apron over a white t-shirt, a rag wrapped around his neck, and a round white cap closely fitted to his bald head, leaned over the counter and motioned for me to do the same. I followed his lead. He spoke in a low, conspiratorial voice. "We're not going to serve you as long as your nigger friend is with you. Get rid of him and we'll be happy to welcome you." Then he smiled and winked at me, suggesting, I thought, that as a fellow white man, I would understand his position completely. He walked back into the kitchen. I returned to our booth in a total state of shock as my 3 buddies looked at me for some explanation. I sat down and was momentarily silent, desperate to come up with some excuse that would not focus on Ted, my black friend. But all 3 were growing impatient, challenging me to say something. My befuddled brain could not come up with an alternative scenario. Finally, I blurted out, "They don't serve Negroes," in barely a whisper. A side note here, in the early 50s, the term black had not come into common usage, and colored or Negro were the only acceptable terms that could be used. The startled look on the 2 faces of my white buddies, Bob and Johnny, suggested the same response as mine, namely, that they too had never been involved in such a blatant discriminatory action back in New York. I felt embarrassed and ashamed, and we all sat in silence, reconciling ourselves to this sudden revelation of life in what was considered a southern city. Finally, Ted spoke up in a way that made it seem that he had some knowledge of racial discrimination, either through previous experience or family forewarnings, and he quietly said, "You guys can stay here and I'll find another place to eat." Those were his exact words, and they were uttered with calm resignation. The exact tone of his voice, not heated or indignant, but with steely resolve, still echoes in my brain down through the decades. The hurt in his eyes was visible. Now Bob, my closest friend among the three, stood up and said in a loud, heated voice echoing through the diner, "Let's get the hell out of here." We followed his lead, and then my defiance quotient rose to equal Bob's, and as we headed for the door, I broke out in song with the Navy anthem, while all the customers stared glumly. Silently, with each of us seeming to be reflecting on the troubling event we had just experienced, we drove around aimlessly in Bob's car until we could tell we were in a black neighborhood and entered a restaurant where we three were the only white faces. I took note that we were cordially received, with several comments welcoming the sailors, and we enjoyed a good meal. For as long as the four of us remained friends, we never spoke about that day in Baltimore. But for me, at 17, and at that time a high school dropout, I felt that my general education on man's inhumanity to man had been advanced by many years. Now I'd like to switch to an educational exercise that has become world famous in showing how easy it is to instill prejudice in the young. Following the death of Martin Luther King in 1968, Jane Elliott was inspired to conduct this exercise with her third grade elementary class. First, she separated her students into two groups, those with blue eyes, who comprised the class majority, and those with brown eyes. She told them that people with blue eyes were better than people with brown eyes. They were smarter and cleaner. She also made the brown-eyed students wear construction paper collars as symbols of their inferior status, made them sit in the back of the class, and made them come in from recess 5 minutes before the blue-eyed children. They were forbidden from drinking directly from the water fountain in the school hallway and had to use cups, and were denied playing privileges on certain playground equipment that the blue-eyed children could use. The students readily accepted, but then rapidly internalized their roles, strongly influenced by their respected authority figure, their beloved teacher. Very quickly, a rift between the students became apparent. The blue-eyed students began to act aggressively toward the brown-eyed children, who just as quickly felt discriminated against. At recess, the blue-eyed children refused to play with the brown-eyed children and harassed them repeatedly, even using the term brown eyes as a new insult and resorting to physical aggression. After the exercise was over for the day, one brown-eyed third grader confessed, "I felt like quitting school. I felt really mad." The next day, Elliott reversed the hierarchy, and the brown-eyed children, who were now the superior group, showed more sympathy for the blue-eyed children because they remembered firsthand how they had felt the previous day. As a result of this experiment, which over years Jane Elliott conducted many times with always similar results, it became startlingly apparent that children who were normally kind, cooperative, and friendly with each other could suddenly become arrogant, discriminatory, and hostile when they felt that they belonged to a superior group, supported and encouraged by an authority figure. The general conclusion from these experiments was how easy it was for adults, as authority figures, to instill prejudice and hatred in children, and the flimsy, unscientific bases they used for instilling such hatred, just unexamined prejudices based on faulty premises that were passed down through generations. When I see marches by white supremacist groups that include children waving signs of hatred for non-white groups, I always think of Jane Elliott's important contribution to anti-racist research. Speaking at a recent conference on racial issues, Jane Elliott asked her large white audience the following question: if they really believed that blacks in America were treated equally to whites, how many would not mind being the same person they were, only black. Not one person raised a hand. When I see the pictures of George Floyd lying in the gutter with a white man's knee on his neck, I see a much larger picture. For 400 years, since the first black slaves were brought to the Jamestown, Virginia colony in 1619, our history indisputably reveals that the white race in America has symbolically had its knee on the neck of black Americans. And I fervently hope that the predictions this time for fundamental changes leading to true racial equality in our society will finally become reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dick.